My parents always put my brother first, golden child. Now they're begging me to help after he kicked them out of their homes, and I was always the kid in the background. My older brother, Caleb, was the golden child, the center of the universe for our parents, Maggie and Rick. He could do no wrong, and even when he did, it somehow became my fault. If Caleb left his toys out, I should have cleaned them up. If Caleb got bad grades, it was because I distracted him. I quickly learned that in our family, Caleb's needs came first, and mine barely made the list. I still remember my 8th birthday. Caleb had a soccer game that same day, so my parents decided to combine the celebrations. I spent the entire afternoon sitting on the bleachers, watching my brother score goals while Maggie and Rick cheered like maniacs. By the time the game was over, everyone was too tired to bother with a cake, so they handed me a store-bought cupcake with a candle already melted halfway through. Caleb got a trophy that day. I got a shrug and, maybe next year, kiddo. Fast forward to adulthood, and not much had changed. Caleb was their pride and joy, a big shot with a fancy corporate job, a shiny car, and endless stories about his successful life. Meanwhile, I worked as a freelance graphic designer, something my dad often dismissed as playing with computers. I wasn't bitter, at least not all the time. I'd built a life for myself, small but stable. I had my own place, a close-knit group of friends, and Olivia, my girlfriend, who always reminded me I deserved better than the crumbs my family tossed my way. Then everything changed a few weeks ago. It started with a phone call at 10 p.m., the kind you know can't bring good news. When I saw Maggie's name flash on the screen, I almost didn't pick up. But guilt, that ever-present ghost of my childhood, pushed me to answer. "Jacob, honey," she began, her voice shaky. "We need to talk." The story poured out like a bad soap opera. Caleb, the perfect son, had cut them off. No explanations, no warnings, just a cold, final severance. And it wasn't just emotional. He drained their joint savings account, taken over their house under some legal pretense, and left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Now, penniless and homeless, they had nowhere else to turn. "We're at the Greyhound station," Maggie said. "Can we come to your place?" I froze. Every rational part of me screamed to say no. These were the same people who had ignored me for years, who had prioritized Caleb at every turn. But then I thought of them sitting in that bus station, two aging parents with nowhere to go. No matter how much I resented them, I couldn't let them sleep on a bench. "Fine," I said, my voice tight. "Come over." When they arrived, they looked nothing like the confident, put-together parents I remembered. Rick's shoulders sagged like he carried the weight of the world, and Maggie's eyes were red from crying. They shuffled into my apartment like ghosts, muttering apologies and thanks. I wanted to feel triumphant, to bask in the irony of them needing me after all these years. Instead, I just felt tired. "I'll set up the guest room," I said, walking away before they could start talking again. Over the next few days, the tension was unbearable. My apartment wasn't big, and having them there made me feel like a stranger in my own home. Rick, true to form, couldn't help making snide remarks. "You should really think about getting a real job, Jake. Something with benefits." Maggie tried to mediate, but her attempts only made things worse. "He's just worried about you, sweetie. You know your brother wouldn't be in this position if he were freelancing." The mention of Caleb was like a slap in the face. I snapped. "Are you seriously comparing me to him right now? He's the reason you're here. Or did you forget that?" The room went silent. Maggie looked like she wanted to cry again, and Rick muttered something about attitude. I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. I needed air, space, anything to get away from them. I called Zach, my best friend since high school, and unloaded everything. "So now they expect me to play the dutiful son," I ranted, pacing the sidewalk outside my building. "After years of treating me like an afterthought, they want me to clean up their mess?" "You don't owe them anything, man," Zach said firmly. "They made their bed, and now they can lie in it. But knowing you, you're gonna help them anyway." I hated that he was right. No matter how much I wanted to walk away, I couldn't. Not yet, at least. When I got back to the apartment, Maggie was sitting on the couch, clutching a mug of tea like it was the only thing holding her together. "I know we've made mistakes, Jacob," she said quietly, but we're trying to make things right. Please don't give up on us." Her words tugged at something deep inside me, something I wasn't ready to face. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "We'll figure it out," I said. "But things have to change." Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The cracks in our family's foundation ran deeper than I imagined, and the secrets buried beneath them were about to surface in ways I couldn't predict. Having my parents in my apartment was like reliving every uncomfortable moment of my childhood, but on steroids. The small space seemed to magnify everything. Rick's passive-aggressive comments, Maggie's overbearing attempts to micromanage, and the suffocating tension that hung over us like a storm cloud. It didn't take long before I started dreading coming home. To maintain some sanity, I laid down ground rules. No bringing up Caleb, no unsolicited advice about my life, and no rearranging anything in my apartment. Of course, none of these stuck. Rick couldn't resist muttering, "If Caleb had this place, it would probably look better." Maggie thought she was being helpful by reorganizing my pantry, which only resulted in me spending 15 minutes looking for my coffee filters. I confided in Olivia, my girlfriend, during one of our late-night calls. "I feel like a stranger in my own home," I admitted. "It's like they've turned this into Caleb's failure recovery zone, except he's not the one here. Why don't you just tell them to leave?" Olivia asked gently. "You've already done more for them than they ever did for you." "I can't," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "They have nowhere else to go." Olivia sighed. "You've got the biggest heart, Jake. Just make sure you're not sacrificing your own happiness for theirs." Her words stuck with me, but I still didn't know how to enforce boundaries with Maggie and Rick. That all came to a head when Aunt Patty called out of the blue. Patty was Maggie's older sister, and while we weren't close, she'd always been a voice of reason in the family drama. "I heard about Caleb," she said without preamble. "I'm guessing your parents didn't tell you the whole story." I frowned, gripping my phone tighter. "What do you mean?" Patty sighed. "It's not my place to say, but let's just say Caleb didn't walk away from them without good reason. You might want to ask your parents why they're really in this mess." Her cryptic words planted a seed of suspicion that only grew over the next few days. I started noticing inconsistencies in Maggie and Rick's stories. They claimed Caleb had drained their savings account, but when I asked how he'd gained access, Maggie deflected with, "It's complicated." Rick insisted Caleb had taken the house through manipulation, but when I pressed for details, he snapped, "Why are you interrogating us? Aren't we suffering enough?" The more evasive they got, the more I realized I wasn't hearing the whole truth. One night, after Rick had gone to bed, I cornered Maggie in the kitchen. "Tell me what's really going on," I said. "Why did Caleb cut you off?" Her face paled, and she avoided my gaze, focusing on her tea instead. "Jacob, it's not as simple as you think." "Then explain it to me," I pressed. "Because from where I'm standing, none of this adds up." Maggie hesitated for what felt like an eternity before finally whispering, "Your brother. He got involved with some bad people. He needed help, and we made some sacrifices to support him." "Sacrifices?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean like giving him all your money in the house?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, her eyes filling with tears. "We thought we were helping him get back on his feet. He promised to pay us back." "And did he?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Maggie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He was so angry when we asked for the money. He said we were selfish and ungrateful. Then he just left." I stared at her, trying to process everything. Caleb wasn't just the golden child. He was a ticking time bomb, and Maggie and Rick had willingly handed him the matches. When I told Zach about the conversation the next day, he wasn't surprised. "Classic golden child syndrome," he said. "They spoiled him rotten, and now they're paying the price." "Yeah, but why is it my problem?" I snapped. "I didn't ask for any of this." "It's not your problem," Zach said firmly. "But they've made it yours because they know you'll fix it." The truth of his words hit me like a freight train. All my life, I've been cleaning up after Caleb's messes, even when it wasn't fair. And now, even when he wasn't here, I was still stuck picking up the pieces. A few days later, Aunt Patty called again. This time, she wasn't cryptic. Caleb's been gambling for years, she said. He got in deep with the wrong crowd. Your parents bailed him out more times than I can count, and now they've got nothing left. The revelation left me speechless. Caleb's perfect life was a facade, built on lies and my parents' blind loyalty. But the real kicker came when Patty added, he tried to pin some of it on you, you know? What? I asked, incredulous. He told your parents that you refused to help him when he was struggling, Patty said. That you were selfish and ungrateful. I don't know if they believed him, but it definitely caused some tension. My head was spinning. Caleb had not only ruined my parents financially, but also tried to paint me as the villain in his mess. I felt a surge of anger I hadn't experienced in years. For so long, I'd kept my head down, playing the role of the responsible son. But now, I wasn't sure I could keep doing it. When I got home that evening, Rick was sitting in my living room, watching TV like he owned the place. Maggie was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she cooked. They looked so comfortable, so oblivious to the chaos they'd brought into my life. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make them see what they'd done. But instead, I went to my room and shut the door. I wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. But one thing was clear. This house of resentments couldn't hold us all much longer. The days dragged on, and the tension in my apartment became unbearable. It wasn't just the old resentments bubbling under the surface anymore. It was the weight of everything I'd learned about Caleb. He wasn't just the golden child who could do no wrong. He was a fraud who had manipulated our parents into financial ruin. And yet, somehow, they still treated him like a saint. One night, I decided I couldn't sit with the anger anymore. I needed answers. When I came home from a particularly exhausting day of work, I threw my bag onto the couch and stood in the living room, staring at Rick and Maggie. We need to talk, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Rick muted the TV and gave me a long, irritated look. What's this about? Caleb, I said simply. I know about the gambling. Maggie's face went pale, and Rick's expression darkened. Who told you that? He asked, his tone defensive. Does it matter? I shot back. What matters is that you've been hiding the truth from me. You let Caleb gamble away your savings, your house, your future, and now you're here acting like I'm supposed to fix it. Maggie started crying, as she always did when the conversation got too uncomfortable. We didn't know what else to do, Jacob, she said. He was in trouble, and we thought we could help. Help? I laughed bitterly. You enabled him. And now, after everything, you still refuse to hold him accountable. Do you even realize what you've done to yourselves? To me, Rick stood up, his face red with anger. Watch your tone, he barked. We're still your parents. No, you're Caleb's parents, I snapped. I was just the backup plan. And now that he's abandoned you, you're only here because you have nowhere else to go. Maggie sobbed harder, but Rick just glared at me, his jaw tightening. You don't know what it's like to have a child in trouble, he said. We did what any good parents would do. Good parents? I repeated, shaking my head. Good parents don't sacrifice one child for the sake of the other. Good parents don't turn a blind eye to years of bad behavior just because it's easier than facing the truth. Rick didn't respond, and for a moment, the room was silent except for Maggie's soft cries. I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. They needed to hear this. You're right about one thing, I continued. I don't know what it's like to have a child in trouble, but I do know what it's like to be the child who's always overlooked. And I'm done being that kid. I stormed out of the apartment before they could say another word. I needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight of their presence. I ended up at a diner across town, where Zach met me after my panic text. You finally confronted them? He asked, sliding into the booth across from me. Yeah, I muttered, staring down at my coffee. It didn't go well. Zach shook his head. It was never going to go well, Jake. People like your parents don't want to face the truth. They've spent years living in denial, and now it's catching up with them. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't keep living like this. You don't have to, Zach said firmly. You've already done more than enough for them. If they can't appreciate that, it's not your problem. His words made sense, but I couldn't shake the guilt. No matter how much I wanted to walk away, a part of me still felt responsible for them. I hated that part of myself. A week later, things took an unexpected turn. Aunt Patty called again, this time with shocking news. Caleb had resurfaced. He's back in town, she said. I saw him at the grocery store yesterday. My stomach twisted. Did he say anything? Patty hesitated. He didn't see me, but I overheard him talking to someone. He mentioned your parents. It didn't sound good. I clenched the phone tighter. What did he say? He said they were dead to him, Patty replied, her voice heavy. He's completely cut them off, Jake. He's not coming back. The words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't care about Caleb's relationship with our parents, but hearing it out loud made everything feel more real. Caleb was done with them, and that meant they were my responsibility now, whether I liked it or not. A few days later, I saw Caleb for myself. I was walking home from the grocery store when I spotted him sitting on a bench, scrolling through his phone. He looked different, thinner, more tired. The confident, charming older brother I'd grown up with was gone, replaced by someone who looked like they'd been through hell. Before I could stop myself, I walked over. Caleb. He looked up, startled, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Shame? It disappeared just as quickly, replaced by his usual smug expression. Jake, he said, leaning back on the bench. Didn't expect to see you here. I could say the same, I replied. Heard you're back in town. He shrugged. Not for long. Just tying up some loose ends. Like screwing over mom and dad? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Caleb smirked, but there was no humor in it. They screwed themselves, Jake. I just stopped playing along. By taking their money? Their house. I shot back. They gave it to me, he said flatly. I didn't force them to do anything. They made their choice, just like I made mine. I stared at him, searching for any sign of remorse, but there was none. Caleb had burned every bridge in his life, and he didn't seem to care. You're unbelievable, I said, shaking my head. They sacrificed everything for you, and you couldn't even... Spare me the lecture, Caleb interrupted, standing up. You think you're so much better than me, but you're just as stuck with them as I was. Good luck with that. He walked away without another word, leaving me standing there, furious and helpless. For years, I'd envied Caleb's place in our family, but now I realized it had been a curse all along. He'd been the golden boy, yes, but he'd also been their scapegoat, their savior, their everything. And now that he was gone, they were clinging to me like a lifeline. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. Having Caleb back in town added another layer of tension to the already unbearable situation at home. It was like his presence lingered in the air, even when he wasn't physically there. My parents avoided talking about him, but their silence said more than words ever could. Maggie would stare at her tea for hours, lost in thought, while Rick became even grumpier and more dismissive. Meanwhile, I felt like I was slowly unraveling. I'd given up my peace and privacy to help my parents, but instead of gratitude, all I got was criticism and guilt. Olivia tried to be supportive, but even she was starting to feel the strain. Maybe we should spend a weekend away, she suggested during one of our rare dinners together. Just you and me. Recharge a little. I wish I could, I said, rubbing my temples. But I can't just leave them. Olivia frowned. Jake, you're allowed to have boundaries. You don't owe them your entire life. I know, I said, but the words felt hollow. No matter how much I wanted to prioritize myself, the weight of my parents' dependence made it impossible. Things came to a head one night when I overheard Maggie and Rick arguing in the living room. Their voices were low, but the walls in my apartment were thin. We can't keep doing this, Rick, Maggie was saying. He's going to crack. He'll be fine, Rick replied gruffly. He's stronger than you think. I stepped into the room, crossing my arms. Care to let me in on the conversation? They both looked startled, like they'd been caught stealing. Maggie wrung her hands, avoiding my gaze, while Rick just glared at me. It's nothing, Rick said. Go back to bed. Don't talk to me like I'm a child, I snapped. If this is about me, I have a right to know. Maggie sighed, finally meeting my eyes. We're just worried about you, Jacob. You've been so stressed lately, and we don't want to be a burden. Too late for that, I muttered under my breath. What was that? Rick asked sharply. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. Look, I'm doing the best I can, but this situation isn't sustainable. You need to figure out a long-term plan, because I can't keep carrying all of this. Rick's face turned red. We didn't ask for this, Jacob. Do you think we wanted to lose everything? No, but you let it happen, I shot back. And now you're here, expecting me to clean up your mess without so much as a thank you. Jacob, please, Maggie said, her voice trembling. We're trying to make things right. We don't know how. Her words tugged at my heart, but I refused to let my guard down. Figure it out, I said. Because if you don't, this isn't going to end well for any of us. I left the room before they could respond, my hands shaking with anger. I hated how easily they could get under my skin, how years of conditioning had left me unable to say no to them. I wanted to believe they were genuinely trying to change, but their actions told a different story. The next day, Aunt Patty called again. She'd been my lifeline throughout this ordeal, offering advice and encouragement when I needed it most. This time, though, her tone was different, more serious. Jacob, you need to think about yourself, she said bluntly. Your parents made their choices, and they have to live with the consequences. You can't keep sacrificing your happiness for their mistakes. I know, I said, though I didn't entirely believe it. But it's not that simple. It is that simple, she insisted. You've done more for them than anyone could have expected. But if you keep this up, you're going to lose yourself in the process. Her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I tried to focus on work that evening. Olivia called to check in, and I finally confessed how overwhelmed I felt. I just don't know what to do, I admitted. No matter what I say or do, it feels like I'm stuck in this endless cycle. Maybe it's time to break the cycle, Olivia said softly. Set an ultimatum. Make them understand that you can't keep living like this. I hesitated, the idea both terrifying and liberating. What if they don't listen? Then you'll know where you stand, she said, and you can start putting yourself first. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between guilt and resentment. I needed to take control of my life, even if it meant risking the fragile relationship I had with my parents. The next morning, I sat Maggie and Rick down at the kitchen table. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to speak. We need to talk, I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. I've done everything I can to help you, but this can't go on. You need to find a way to support yourselves, because I can't keep doing it. Rick opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop him. Let me finish. I love you both, but I've spent my entire life being second to Caleb. I won't let that happen anymore. I deserve to have my own life, and I'm not going to sacrifice it for your mistakes. Maggie started crying, but I didn't waver. This isn't me abandoning you, I said. This is me setting boundaries. I'll help you figure out a plan, but after that, you're on your own. Rick looked furious, but he didn't say anything. Maggie just nodded, her tears falling silently. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, like maybe, just maybe, I was finally taking control of my life. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The cracks in our family were too deep to heal overnight, and the real test was yet to come. The aftermath of my ultimatum felt like the calm before a storm. Maggie and Rick tiptoed around me, their usual criticisms replaced by uneasy silence. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had some semblance of control in our relationship, but I knew this peace wouldn't last. Years of resentment and dysfunction don't vanish with one conversation. True to my word, I started looking into resources for them. I researched affordable housing options, local job assistance programs, and even charities that might help them get back on their feet. Maggie thanked me quietly when I handed her a list of leads. Rick, unsurprisingly, had nothing to say. His pride wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, Caleb's shadow loomed larger than ever. Aunt Patty called again with more information about his return. Apparently, he'd been seen at a bar downtown, ranting about the family and how he was done with all of us. According to Patty, he wasn't just cutting ties. He was burning bridges. You should be careful, Jacob, she warned. Caleb's in a bad place. If he knows your parents are staying with you, he might try to stir up trouble. I didn't think much of it at the time. Caleb might have been reckless and selfish, but I didn't see him as a threat. That assumption would come back to haunt me. A week later, everything came crashing down. It started with an unannounced visit from Aunt Patty. She showed up at my apartment looking more frazzled than I'd ever seen her. Maggie and Rick were in the living room when she arrived, and their faces immediately filled with dread. "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing for bad news. "It's Caleb," Patty said, her voice tight. "He's been telling people that you've taken over the family's finances. He's making it sound like you're controlling them." "What?" I said, my jaw dropping. "That's ridiculous." "I know," Patty said, "but he's been spreading the story to anyone who'll listen. He's even been talking to some of the extended family. They're starting to think you're taking advantage of your parents." I stared at her in disbelief. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, Caleb was trying to ruin me. My hands clenched into fists as a wave of anger swept through me. "This is insane," I said. "Why would he do this?" Maggie and Rick exchanged a nervous glance. I could tell they knew more than they were letting on. "What aren't you telling me?" I demanded. Maggie hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. He's angry, Jacob. He thinks we betrayed him by coming to you. He blames us for everything that's happened. So instead of taking responsibility, he's making me the scapegoat," I said bitterly. "Typical Caleb." Rick finally spoke, his tone gruff. "We didn't ask him to do this. We've been trying to keep you out of it." "Not hard enough," I snapped. "He's out there ruining my reputation, and you're just sitting here doing nothing?" Before they could respond, my phone buzzed. It was Olivia. I stepped into the hallway to answer, my heart racing. "Jake, you need to get online," she said, her voice urgent. "Caleb posted something about you." "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Check your social media," she said. "I'll call you back." I hung up and opened my phone, my hands shaking. Sure enough, Caleb had posted a long, rambling message accusing me of exploiting our parents. He claimed I'd forced them out of their home, taken their money, and left them with nothing. The post was filled with lies, but it was convincing enough to stir up sympathy from people who didn't know the full story. Comments flooded in, some from family members, others from strangers. Words like ungrateful and manipulative jumped out at me, each one a knife to the chest. My anger turned to panic as I realized the extent of the damage Caleb was causing. I called Olivia back, barely able to keep my voice steady. "He's trying to destroy me." "Then you need to fight back," she said. "Tell your side of the story. Don't let him control the narrative." I wanted to believe it was that simple, but years of being overshadowed by Caleb had left me doubting myself. Who would believe me over him? The breaking point came that evening when Maggie and Rick tried to defend Caleb. "He's just lashing out," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "He's hurt, Jacob. He feels abandoned. So that gives him the right to lie about me?" I snapped. "To ruin my life because he can't face the consequences of his own actions?" Rick scowled. "He's your brother. Family forgives." I stared at them, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Family forgives? Funny how that only applies to Caleb. When have you ever forgiven me for not being him? The room went silent. For the first time, they had no response. And in that moment, I realized something important. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn something they were never going to give me. The next day, I made a decision. I reached out to Aunt Patty and arranged a family meeting. If Caleb wanted to drag me into the mud, I was going to confront him head-on, and I wasn't going to do it alone. The meeting took place at Patty's house, a neutral ground where no one could claim the upper hand. Caleb arrived late, looking as smug as ever. He didn't even acknowledge me, instead greeting Maggie and Rick like nothing had happened. "Let's get this over with," I said, crossing my arms. "Caleb, you've been lying about me. You've been spreading rumors and trying to make me look like the villain." "Why?" Caleb shrugged. "If the shoe fits." "Cut the crap," I snapped. "I've spent my entire life cleaning up after you, and I'm done. You don't get to ruin me just because you're miserable." The room erupted into chaos as everyone started shouting at once. Maggie begged us to stop fighting. Rick tried to play the mediator, and Aunt Patty yelled for everyone to calm down. But I didn't let Caleb off the hook. You want to talk about betrayal? I said, my voice cutting through the noise. You betrayed all of us. You lied, you stole, and now you're trying to destroy what little family we have left. You're a coward, Caleb, and I'm not cleaning up your mess anymore. For the first time, Caleb looked shaken. He didn't have a snappy comeback or a smug retort. He just sat there, his face pale, as the weight of my words sank in. When the meeting ended, I walked out without looking back. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it still hurt. Breaking the cycle wasn't easy, and it came with a cost. In the weeks that followed, I started rebuilding my life. Maggie and Rick eventually moved into a small apartment, funded by a combination of charity and the resources I'd found for them. Caleb disappeared again, leaving behind the wreckage of his golden boy legacy. And me? I finally felt free. Free from the guilt, the resentment, and the endless comparisons. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. If you like the story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments. Write what you think about this and what could be done better.